feathery looks are back in fashion.
One thing that makes feathers stand out as a fashion device is that they change the profile of the individual. Charles Darwin even commented in one of his writings when he said, "The head is the chief seat of adornment, true in people and also true in birds, where you see feathers in a crest that is visible from a long way off, telling one bird what species of bird it's looking at."
Biologist and author Thor Hanson explores the unexpected origins of feathers in fashion and how our quest for plumes brought some species to the brink of extinction.
We find plumage attractive in the same way that birds find it attractive. We have co-opted them for many of the same purposes for which they evolved in nature.
The history of feathers in human fashions runs deep. Indigenous cultures around the world co-opted feathers from local birds, often as displays of social status.
Elaborate feather capes were made in the Hawaiian Islands. On certain South Pacific islands, people used them as a currency. The Aztecs made feathered costumes, detailed paintings. The Nazcas in Peru, the Egyptians had strong traditions about the importance of feathers in their culture. So feathers run deep in cultures. In male fashion, feather work for a long time was associated with the military and prowess on the battlefield. The very phrase, "a feather in his cap," comes to us from a tradition where feathers were added to the helms of warriors who performed well during battles.
Throughout time, rare and expensive plumes were used by the wealthy to convey status, but it wasn't really until the 19th century that featherwork in fashion expanded and became focused on women's looks, specifically feathered hats.
Ostrich feathers in particular had great value as well at that time. So much so that in South Africa, there were ostrich ranches where they had up to 1 million birds under domestication. And you could harvest the feathers from domesticated ostrich sustainably by clipping the feather off at the base, and the birds would simply grow a new set of plumes in the next season. So ostrich feathers had so much value at that time that it is a point of fact that when the Titanic sank in 1912, the most valuable cargo on the ship was not some fancy diamond as you might see in the movies, but it was feathers. 40 cases of prime ostrich plumes on their way from the feather merchants of London to the hat makers of New York City, and valued in today's dollars at nearly $2.5 million.
At the peak of the Gilded Age bird hat craze, famed ornithologist Frank Chapman was astounded at the variety of species he observed on the streets in 1886.
He walked through the financial district, and he quickly managed to tabulate 40 different species of birds that he might have seen in Central Park, but they were all adorning the hats of the women walking down the street. This, of course, was having a terrible impact on wild bird populations, really around the world.
One of the casualties was the Carolina parakeet, which went extinct in the wild in 1904, a victim of hunting and deforestation. Another species being ravaged was the snowy egret.
It had wonderful plumes that held their shape in all sorts of great ways, and so it led to these great hunting efforts that were wiping out egret colonies. It doesn't take long for that sort of hunting practice to bring the populations crashing down. The desire for beautiful hats and other fashion items was driving, in some cases, close to the extinction of some of what had once been common birds. This is where we see the beginnings of the Audubon Society, through groups of women organizing to push back against this fashion craze. And it led to this idea that people should give up something that may have value economically to preserve things in nature. It was a radical idea at the time, but it led to the passing in North America of bills and laws that are still on the books protecting birds today.
Eventually, during World War I, feathered hats began to fall out of favor, with more women entering the workplace and the rise of automobiles, places where fancy plumed hats were inconvenient.
It turns out there are very few things in nature that have evolved for as many purposes as feathers. Yes, they can be beautiful and used for allurement in the birds, but they have also evolved to be waterproof, to protect the birds from the elements. There are feathers that are the best insulation we know of, wonderfully fluffy, trapping all that heat against the body of the bird. And then, of course, there are flight feathers that are an airfoil shape, giving them wonder maneuverability in flight. and are now very visible in the fossil evidence within a particular lineage of dinosaurs, the theropods, which include such famous meat-eaters as Tyrannosaurus rex and the velociraptors. They had plumes that resemble what we see today in birds. Display was an early use of feathers. Way back in the dinosaurs, there are fossils so well preserved that they contain structures that allow paleontologists to interpret the color of the feathers. These little organelles called melanosomes are associated with color. We know that dinosaur feathers were colored. We know that they must have been used for display. So this history of plumage that is used for attracting mates, used for various displays in the bird kingdom, has a very, very long history. Because feathers are used in mating rituals to attract a mate, there's great evolutionary pressure on their shape and on their color and on their effectiveness at that task. And that means that there is a huge range of feather colors and shapes in nature, different ways that birds have evolved their plumage for that sense of allurement. The birds of paradise have evolved not only elaborate plumage, but incredible dances to go along with them, where they have medallions of colored feathers, and they have elaborate wing feathers where they thrust them up behind them so you almost lose the shape of the bird in this creative display of featherwork. And it's typically the males of the species that do this sort of display. And so you end up in these situations of what biologists call runaway selection, where because the females have a preference for a particular look in the males, there's increased pressure for evolution to make that look even more and more extreme. And that leads us to display feathers of a peacock, for example. Totally outrageous and with no function in nature other than to look good for females. We all know ostriches are flightless. They gave up the ability to fly and followed a different evolutionary strategy, gaining large size, fast running capabilities to live on the savannas of Africa. So where you see a typical flight feather that has a closed vein and an offset rachis to give it an aerodynamic airfoil shape, the ostriches have done away with that completely. The flight feather of an ostrich looks like this. The veins are not closed whatsoever. They have lost all those things and evolved specifically for purposes of display. Some biologists feel that the elaborate featherwork is what we call an honest display, that it must be connected to some advantage that you might get from mating with that particular male. Other biologists feel that this sort of runaway selection can just be beauty for beauty's sake. It doesn't actually connect to anything about their vigor. It's not unusual to see ostriches featured heavily in fashion because they have these wonderful, large, lustrous feathers that are used for display on the birds. They are decorating her arms, in a sense, which is extremely appropriate because these are flight feathers from probably a male ostrich to have that much luster and display. When we go to a function like the Met Gala, it's almost like going bird watching in a way. The idea of allurement, to look beautiful, to attract attention. Isn't it a happy coincidence? We find feathers beautiful in the same ways that birds do. They use them to display to one another. We can borrow them and use them to display amongst ourselves, meaning that we have a lot more in common with our feathered friends than we might have ever thought.